Welcome. Today's reading is Immanuel Kant's Freedom and Equality. This is a short excerpt pulled from an essay by Immanuel Kant. So let's have a look at Kant's opening passage on page 97. This runs Freedom and Equality by Immanuel Kant is on pages 97 and 98 of Political Thought. Just begin at the beginning here where Kant defines human freedom. What is Kant's definition of human freedom? Here on page 97, he writes, "No one can compel me to be happy in accordance with his conception of the welfare of others, for each may seek his happiness in whatever way he sees fit, so long as he does not infringe upon the freedom of others to pursue a similar end, which can be reconciled with the freedom of everyone else within a workable general law." So whatever it is you're taking yourself to be free to do, that better be compatible with other people likewise being able to do that, or at the very least not having their rights and their interests infringed on by your activity. So there's a sort of qualification here to your freedom, which is that it must be compatible with the freedom of others and with their equality. They're on equal standing with you, and whatever it is you're going to do as a free human being, you're limited by the freedom of others. Okay, so he must accord to others the same right as he enjoys himself. This is something like the principle of equality. Well, he now goes on to discuss different kinds of governments that are possible, and one he says is a sort of benevolent despotism, a paternal government, wherein Kant writes on page 97 here towards the bottom that under this paternalistic kind of government, the subjects, as Kant puts it here, as immature children who cannot distinguish what is truly useful or harmful to themselves. And boy, we're talking about adult human beings here, and that language basically infantilizes political subjects. Nonetheless, the subjects are treated as immature children who cannot distinguish what is truly useful or harmful to themselves, and under such a government of paternalistic despotism, this government would be obliged, the subjects under this government would be obliged to behave purely passively and to rely upon the judgment of the head of state as to how they ought to be happy, and upon his kindness in willing their happiness at all. That's an interesting characterization of a kind of government that was fairly typical in Kant's day and prior to Kant. Monarchy, for instance. And anyways, what he's saying is, under a government like this, where the head of state or the executive is considered a sort of figurehead, a sort of father almost, subjects are reduced to the status of children and must sort of look to their authority figure to understand to understand how they ought to be happy. So to even have their conception of happiness articulated for them, right? So these political subjects don't even have the ability or the right to decide their own happiness, is what Kant's getting at. They must have that decided for them. Such a government, as he puts it, is the greatest conceivable despotism. That is, it's a constitution which suspends the entire freedom of its subjects. I mean, it bears noting here that despotism, right, is a pejorative term here for a kind of political rule that is akin to the rule of a master over slaves. Despotes in ancient Greek means master. And so when we talk about despotism, we're talking about a political system where the rulers function almost as masters and the political subjects seem to be reduced to the status of slaves. And this is not something Kant wants to affirm here. He says such a government, right, in which the leader is like a father that makes the decisions, the subjects are like children. This constitution suspends the entire freedom of its subjects, who therefore have no rights whatsoever. Now, this had been a typical form of government in Kant's time and prior to Kant's time, and so he's criticizing it for its right? For its authoritarianism, for the fact that there is no freedom, there is no equality, and it essentially is a sort of slave system of government. Now, to distinguish, and so he wants to distinguish this kind of paternalistic despotism from a different kind, right? He says you can have a patriotic government, right, in which you will have a sort of authority figure, but you won't have these disagreeable features of an absence of freedom, for instance. So let's look on the top of page 98. A patriotic attitude is one where everyone in the state, including its head, regards the commonwealth as a maternal womb, or the land as the paternal ground from which he himself sprang and which he must leave to his descendants as a treasured pledge. Each regards himself as authorized to protect the rights of the commonwealth by laws of the general will, but not to submit it to his personal use at his own absolute pleasure. So in this form of government, right, or this kind of attitude, I should say that political subjects can take up to government. Well, here what we have is both citizens and the head of state regarding their nation, their commonwealth, as either a maternal womb or a paternal ground, right? The gender I don't think particularly important here. The idea is just this is something like sacred ground. This is the ground which gave birth to me. Something, I mean, ultimately this goes back to autochthonic myths in antiquity, origin stories that we as a people literally arose from the earth in this area, and that's why we have a claim to this land. Also, the Commonwealth not only is regarded as this kind of womb or ground and source from which we come, but is also something like a legacy that we inherit from our ancestors and that we pass down to our descendants, right? And the general rule seems to be pass down to your descendants something equal to or better than what you received. And if you don't do that, you have failed as a generation. Okay, so he's articulating different sorts of political attitudes that can characterize political subjects under different kinds of governments. If we look now in the second paragraph on page 98, he starts to get into more modern and contemporary forms of government where we don't have some sort of strong man or tyrant. Why I said contemporary, and yet sometimes it does seem as though we are currently living under a system like that, a kind of paternalistic despotism. But nonetheless, we still technically have elections in this country and whatnot. So if we look on page 98 to get into democratic government, particularly, Kant will here argue. Well, first he's going to define political equality, and let's see what he says about equality here. Man's equality as a subject, Kant writes on page 98, might be formulated as follows. Each member of the Commonwealth has rights of coercion in relation to all the others, except in relation to the head of state. So equality for Kant means that each of us has rights of coercion in relation to all the others. Exactly what he's getting at here, I mean, I think what he means is we each have rights. We each have rights that allow us to impose obligations and duties upon others, and ultimately we have the right to hold others accountable for wrongdoing, harming us or others, and we can bring to bear the sort of legal force of the state, whether through the court system, through the police agencies, whatnot, civil lawsuits, etc., to hold other people to the laws and the rules and the principles that allow us to act freely but within limits where we have to respect other people's rights and liberty and equality and dignity as well. Now, what's interesting to me here on page 98 is that Kant writes, each member of the Commonwealth has rights of coercion in relation to all the others except in relation to the head of state. So there's been this ongoing dispute in the circus that we call our government these days, and recently, in the last few years, William Barr, the current Attorney General, Donald Trump, the President, others have made a claim that the executive, that executive branch should not be subject to governance by, for instance, the legislature and Congress. And I think one thing Kant's doing here is he's providing something like an argument for this position. So strangely enough, right, we have Kant, who's thought of often as a liberal within the history of philosophy, providing a sort of rationale here for people that today are certainly not regarded as liberals. William Barr and Donald Trump, the idea being something like the head of state is not subject to the law. The head of state, according to Kant, cannot be subject to the law, because if you make the head of state subject to the law, you make the head of state subject to those who make the laws, legislatures, and so then you're essentially turning over the executive power to the legislature, or at least making the executive have to, potentially you're going to allow the executive branch to be controlled by the legislature, Kant would say, right? If the executive is subject to the law, whoever is in charge of the law, right? Even if it's a matter of, you know, if the president commits a crime, as he says, if he shoots somebody on Fifth Avenue or whatever the case might be, he says he can't be held responsible for it, or his base wouldn't care. Well, Kant is providing an argument for why, there's a sense in which if you are head of state, you should not be subject to any law whatsoever. Why? Well, all who are subject to laws are subjects of the state and are thus subject to the right of coercion along with all other members of the Commonwealth. The only exception, Kant says, is a single person. And for him, right, this could potentially be the president today in a place like the United States, the head of state, right? This is the exception, through whom alone the rightful coercion of all others can be exercised. So Kant's point is the executive is ultimately the sort of, the buck stops there when it comes to enforcing and implementing law. And so if you make that executive subject to the law and yet require the executive to enforce and implement law, you're going to be doing two opposed things that contradict each other, and you're going to make it impossible, essentially, for the executive to be effective. The executive will have to potentially deal with all sorts of political issues related to these other branches of government, these other agencies in government, right? And we're seeing, in a sense, in this political turmoil over the past few years, a version of what Kant is concerned with here has been playing out in the American public sphere. And what's interesting is, honestly, it's interesting to me anyways, that you could make a case here that Immanuel Kant is providing support and reasons to support the Attorney General Barr and President Trump's position over the last few years. I just find that kind of amusing. Strange bedfellows. Okay. Okay. So anyways, that's the upshot of the middle of page 98 here. Kant is making a claim that the executive alone cannot be subject to the law and be expected to implement and enforce the law at the same time. Whoever it is that's ultimately responsible for enforcing law must not themselves be subject to it. Boy, I mean, would this also entail immunity for police officers, for instance? It's hard to say, but we can see a host of issues around this dilemma, and I just want us to think about what Kant's position is here, not necessarily agree with it, but it's certainly worth consideration. And ultimately, it's a logical issue for him. He just thinks logically, if you are the executive, you are executing law. You cannot execute law and impose law and yet also obey and be the subject of law at the same time. To him, it's a logical contradiction. Alright, so the uniform equality of human beings as subjects of a state, Kant goes on to say, is perfectly consistent with the utmost inequality of the mass and degree of its possessions. So this is where we begin to see some really interesting theoretical contortions in the history of political liberalism here. We can have something like equality, and yet have incredible inequality of wealth, right? In the same way that today we have sort of equality as citizens before the law, and so far as, for instance, you're a citizen of the United States, you are equal to any other citizen, right? If you are arrested, you're supposed to be read your Miranda rights, etc., and on and on. And yet we have tremendous inequality when it comes to the wealth in this country. And according to Kant, there's nothing to see here. This is not a problem. I want us to understand what he's getting at here, but also not necessarily agree with him. We certainly do not have to, right? Anyways, what he's getting at is there may be deep inequalities of wealth. Nevertheless, he says, they are all equal as subjects before the law. Now, as if wealth doesn't play a role in the law, right? As if having, money to afford high-priced lawyers or something like this doesn't give you an advantage over somebody with a public defender. These are all sorts of issues, I think, that make it really hard, I think, to accept at face value this. On the one hand, we can understand what it means to be equal before the law. It means, for instance, when you're arrested, you should be read your Miranda rights, and a variety of there are a variety of ways we could illustrate this kind of equality before the law. Everybody, for instance, who's a citizen can vote, and each person gets one vote, and you don't get two votes, for instance, because you earn twice as much money as someone else, or have been alive twice as long as they have, etc. So there's this principle of equality, right? And it's often a formal equality, but then materially or in terms of substance, often there is great difference between people. Now, he's going to go on, though, and look at this last passage. He's going to say there is one way, though, right, in which treating somebody not as an equal is justified. Everybody's equality should be respected, and dignity should be respected, but he says, no one, however, can lose this authority to coerce others and to have rights towards them. So that is, we all have this natural equality and this natural freedom that's balanced with the equality, right? I have the freedom to act in the way that I determine, but I have to respect the rights of others, and I can't violate their liberty. Well, so this creates something like generalized equality, but what Kant says is there is a way to lose this equality by committing a crime. He says, and no one can voluntarily renounce his rights by a contract or legal transaction to the effect that he has no rights but only duties. So committing a crime is one way, right? Another point he wants to make here in closing, though, is that you can't it's also these rights are inalienable, is how it's often put, right? You may not renounce these rights. You may not surrender these rights. This is interesting, right? No one can voluntarily renounce his rights by a contract or legal transaction to the effect that he has no rights but only duties. In a sense, for such a contract would deprive him of the right to make a contract that does invalidate the one he had already made. I would want us to think about what he's saying right here at the very end with reference to some of the scandals over the past few years involving non-disclosure agreements. Do you have the right to voluntarily relinquish your right to free speech, by signing a contract swearing you will not speak of something in exchange for payment, in exchange for something? I think Kant, he's getting at here, is the answer is no, right? What we're calling non-disclosure agreements today in the United States and their legal justification, Kant is saying, amounts to the alienation of inalienable rights. We're surrendering the right to free speech in an illegitimate manner. We're allowing people to pay us to keep our mouth shut, and that should not be something that is legally possible. Okay, that's enough for Immanuel Kant on freedom and equality today. I will see you next time. Take care.